So we're pleased today to have Joe Nigro with us. Mr. Nigro currently serves as the Public Defender for Lancaster County, a position he's held for roughly 4 years now. But that's a little bit misleading because he has worked for the Public Defender's Office for 35 years. He's a graduate of the University of Nebraska. He's earned his bachelor's degree and law degree from UNL. Mr. Nigro has been extraordinarily active in community service functions, among many, many other duties that he has had past and present. He is currently on the board of the Nebraska Criminal Defense Attorneys Association, currently serves as a member of the House of Delegates for the Nebraska Bar Association. Joe also serves on the Justice Reinvestment Coordinating Committee, the Justice Behavioral Health Committee, currently chairing a committee that is seeking to establish a mental health court in the state of Nebraska, plural, mental health courts in the state of Nebraska. He works very closely with state legislators when it comes to some legislation. And most importantly, he is on the board of directors of the UNL Alumni Association. Joe.
Hi. Is my mic on? You can hear me? Yeah. I'm Joe Nigro. I grew up in Omaha, came down here to the university for both undergraduate and law school, and then about 6 weeks after I passed the bar exam, went to work at the Public Defender's Office, and in November it'll be 35 years that I've been there. I was asked to speak to kind of talk about our office and what we do, and then I thought I would get into some current issues involving criminal justice reform, which has been a very active area at the legislature. It's been an active area nationally too. I'm going to explain a little bit about how our office works. We don't choose who we represent. When somebody goes to court the very first time, if it's an offense that carries a possibility of incarceration, the judge is going to, after the person's been informed of the charges and the possible penalties, and bond is set, that's an amount of money to assure their appearance in court, the judge is going to ask if they can afford to hire an attorney. And if they say no, the judge will ask some financial questions, and then the court decides whether to appoint our office. So we, as I said, we don't choose who we represent. People come to us from the court. We represent people on felonies that carry more than a year in jail. We represent people on misdemeanors that carry up to a year. We represent offenders in juvenile court for both law violations and offenses such as truancy. And we represent people who are being held at the crisis center facing a mental health commitment. And in my career, I've done all of those. And so, as I indicated, the first time somebody appears in court, it's called an arraignment, and that's where they're informed of the charges, bond set, and whether or not our office is appointed. People then come to our office, or if they're in custody, we go to see them, and we do that first interview, and we get their version of what happened. On some of the types of offenses, we get police reports right away from the prosecutor, so we have a pretty good idea of what all their evidence is, but sometimes we don't know very much. But we try to get the client's version and then sort of figure out where to go from there with the case. And so we have, our office contains, besides 23 attorneys, amongst other staff members, we have 2 investigators. So we may send investigators out to talk to witnesses. There may be people who aren't in the police reports that our clients told us about. Our client may have a different version. Since I've been in charge, we've added a social worker to our staff, and that's really been helpful because many, many of our clients have issues involving mental health and substance abuse. And so if we can get the social worker involved right away to try and get people assessed and into treatment or connected with services, it's really making a difference. And it gives us a better chance if we're doing a bond review, if the person is in custody and they can't get out, to try and convince the court to reduce bond if we have a plan for them. And eventually, if somebody's facing sentencing, that social worker can help us prepare sentencing plans, because if you can lower some of those risk factors, that really helps. And it's allowing us to do some things that the attorneys weren't trained to do and didn't really have time. And for example, in our juvenile cases, our social worker is now able to go and investigate every person we represent who's placed out of the home to check on placements. So it's really making our representation more complete, and I'm really proud that we were able to add that person. Obviously, early on, you're trying to assess the state's evidence. Can they prove what they've filed? Because the burden's on the state. There's no burden on the defense. And you're looking at various defenses. I mean, maybe the person wasn't there, maybe they didn't do it, maybe it was self-defense, maybe there's something involving mental health issues. All cases in adult court start in county court. And for most of you, if you ever have to go to court, that's the court most people come into contact with, because that's where traffic offenses are taken care of, less serious matters. More serious cases are handled in district court, but even felonies start in county court. So misdemeanors get set for trial in county court, and then it's a question of whether the case is going to go to trial or whether we're going to work out some kind of a plea agreement. Felonies have to go to district court, and to get it to district court, the county attorney has to convince a county judge at a preliminary hearing that there's some evidence called probable cause against that client, and if the judge agrees. So that hearing is like a trial, but it's less formal. The rules of evidence don't apply. And if that case gets bound over to district court, then it's almost like starting over. Then the person is arraigned for the first time on a felony. That first appearance in district court, people plead not guilty, and then it's set for trial. Now, before any case goes to trial, the defense is going to do what's called discovery. Generally on misdemeanors, we get all the police reports, so we already know everything that they have. In district court, we usually would be filing a motion to discover. And under Nebraska law, they have to provide certain things. And you have a right to take depositions, which are statements made in front of a court reporter under oath. And the court reporter takes it down. That allows you to explore a little more in more detail what the state's witnesses might say. And if they say something different or inconsistent at trial, then you can attack their credibility with a prior inconsistent statement. Before trial, you're also assessing whether you should file pretrial motions, such as motions to suppress. And for example, if you think that the police obtained evidence from your client in violation of their constitutional rights or questioned them in violation of their rights, then you could try to keep the state from using that evidence at trial. And so, you know, the Constitution protects against unreasonable search and seizure, and you also have a right against self-incrimination and a right to an attorney. And so the court has a hearing outside the presence of a jury on those issues, and then would decide whether to allow that kind of evidence. Eventually, if you can't resolve the case, and you should understand that probably only about 2% of cases go to trial. Most cases get resolved without a trial. Then you're going to go through all the steps of a trial. So if it's a jury trial, you're going to do voir dire, which is the jury selection process. Voir dire is a French term, and it means to speak the truth. And you're trying to get jurors to talk to you. If people have some sort of a bias or some sort of a conflict that would not allow them to sit, then you could ask the court to excuse that person for cause. But for example, on felonies, we have 12-person juries. On misdemeanors, it's 6-person juries. So you're going to have double the number. And so once everybody's passed for cause, then each side can eliminate 6 people on a 12-person jury without giving a reason at all. That's called a preemptory challenge. And the jurors don't know who you're eliminating. So as you're trying to get people to talk, you're trying to get them to admit bias. And if it's really strong, then you could get them excused for cause and replaced with somebody else. But ultimately, for the preemptory challenges, it's kind of instinct, or you just try to think about some of the answers. You try to think about who might be the foreperson of the jury and help shape the jury. You're really picking who's not on the jury. You're not picking the jury. And then the trial starts, so the state goes first because they have the burden, so there's opening statements. They call their witnesses first, and when it's your witness, it's called direct examination. You're supposed to ask open-ended questions, and then the other side gets to question them, and that's cross-examination when you can ask leading questions, and if you're good at it, really that witness should not be saying anything more than yes or no. You should really be testifying and just having them agree with you. Once the state rests, then the defense can put on evidence, but they have no burden, so the defendant can remain silent. They don't have to testify. They don't have to call any witnesses. And then after that, ultimately there'd be closing arguments, and then the judge would instruct the jury, and they would retire and deliberate until they're unanimous. If they can't reach a unanimous verdict, then you could have a hung jury, and then a mistrial would be declared, and then those could be retried later. And then we represent people, and then if they're found guilty, if they're acquitted, then they're free to go. If they're found guilty, then sentencing is set at a later time, and the probation office does a background report. You get access to that, and then you get to you can supply materials, and then you advocate for your client, and then the sentence is imposed. And if the defendant is not happy with the sentence, or if there were issues at trial where you think the court made a mistake in some of his rulings, you can appeal. Some people misunderstand what an appeal is. On an appeal, the appellate court's not looking at new evidence. They're only looking at the transcript of what happened in court and trying to decide if the court made an incorrect ruling or if they imposed an excessive sentence. Now, if you win on appeal, sometimes you might get a new trial, but the appeal itself is just going over the record. So I think, it's been interesting to me in just the last few years. There have been some TV programs, but I think particularly with the explosion of podcasts, there have been some really interesting ones with criminal justice issues that I think have really shed a lot of light about how the system doesn't always work the way it should. And I don't know if any of you listened to Serial. That was out a few years ago, but at the time it was the most downloaded podcast. And it's about a guy in prison in Maryland for life for killing his girlfriend. They were in high school. But it looks like he might get a new trial. And but there are a lot of weird things that happen in that case. And there's been a recent one. I don't know. Has anybody listened to In the Dark? There have been 2 seasons. And the first one was about a boy who was abducted in Minnesota and they didn't solve the case for 27 years. And it's really quite interesting because it shows how the police made a lot of mistakes in that case, but there were other issues. The sex offender registration law came about because of that case. And interestingly, the mother of the victim, when you listen, she's incredibly composed and articulate about how that law is not doing what it was intended to do, and she thinks it's been overkill. And I don't know. I give her a lot of credit because she went through the worst thing that could happen, and yet she's really thoughtful about those issues. But the second season is about a black man in Mississippi who has been tried 6 times for the same case, and he's been on death row for 21 years. And there's a lot of things that have happened in that case that just seem very, very wrong to me. So anyway, I highlight those, just like the Making a Murderer series on Netflix. I think it's another one that, they really do reveal how sometimes there can be real abuses by the police or by prosecutors, and it can result in really tragic consequences for people. One of the things I noticed in Making a Murderer is when the individuals are questioned, the techniques used by the police. I've watched tapes of so many clients being interviewed. It's like you kind of know how that questioning is going to go. But there's a very popular technique that police have used going back to the 1950s called the Reed technique, and the person who created it was named Reed, and he was a detective, and I think he was from Chicago, but there have been some cases here in Nebraska, and he was actually involved in one. There have been some cases in Nebraska that really were miscarriages of justice, and there was a guy named Darrell Parker in the 1950s who was the city forester. It's a position that doesn't exist anymore, and his wife was killed. And Detective Reed, I don't know why he was here or he was brought in, but the thing about the Reed technique is that it can get people to confess. It doesn't necessarily tell you what really happened. And Darrell Parker confessed and then later recanted that he'd killed his wife. He was convicted. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. And years later, there was an individual in prison for another homicide, and he told his attorneys he had actually killed Darrell Parker's wife. But there's attorney-client privilege. He told them they couldn't tell anybody, so they couldn't reveal that he had committed this crime. And so they didn't reveal it until after their client had passed away, and then Darrell Parker was freed. But he spent decades in prison for something he didn't do. Many of you might be familiar with this case that happened down in Gage County, down in Beatrice, in the 1980s, where this elderly woman was, if I recall correctly, was sexually assaulted and then killed, and there were 6 people charged. They were threatened with the death penalty if they didn't testify against the person the police believed was the main culprit, and they were all convicted and sentenced to long terms in prison, and the main person I know certainly was sentenced to life. And it turned out that there was evidence indicating that they were not the people responsible, And the sheriff was aware of it, and so was the prosecutor, and they never revealed it to the defense, which is a violation. And so those people were all freed from prison. And the main person wound up having some health issues, and he's passed away. But, you know, it's one thing when there's a mistake, but these people, because they were scared of the death penalty, actually confessed to something they didn't do, and particularly implicated this, was supposed to be the main person. So those 6 people sued, or the estate and the estate of the deceased person, they sued Gage County, and they won a verdict of $28 million. And so they're looking at raising taxes down in Gage County now to pay this judgment off. But those people's lives were ruined. And, you know, and that was through misconduct by law enforcement and the prosecution. There was another case in the last, 15 years maybe, out in Cass County, just east of us, where a husband and wife were killed at night in their home, were shot to death, and they had arrested a cousin, and he confessed and implicated another cousin, and he was lower functioning intellectually, and then he recanted, but it was a really serious case. I mean, it could have potentially been a death penalty case, but there was a ring found in a truck, and there was an inscription on this ring, and somebody looked into it, and it turned out there was a young couple from Wisconsin that had gone on the run and done a number of burglaries, including one in Iowa. That ring was taken from a burglary in Iowa, and those people were ultimately implicated in the murder of this couple in Cass County. And initially, the police were so convinced that the cousins were involved that they were, you know, trying to get this couple to say that they'd done, all 4 had done it, but the cousins had nothing to do with it. It was just this couple from Wisconsin. And to make it even worse, Cass County didn't have sophisticated crime scene people, so they had the Douglas County Sheriff from Omaha come down with their crime scene expert, and he planted blood to strengthen the state's case, and he went to prison for that. But, you know, you look at that, and you know, that happened here in Nebraska. And one of the saddest things about it is I talked to one of the attorneys afterwards, and in this family there was a huge rift after when these cousins were implicated in this death. And even after it was proven that they had absolutely nothing to do with it, people in the family who had feelings against them, they couldn't get beyond that. So there was still this huge division in the family. And so, you know, those guys' lives were really, really impacted by what had happened there, although fortunately they didn't get convicted, and they didn't get sentenced to death. I mean, it's one of the indications of the death penalty being such a serious matter, because if you get things wrong, you can't take it back. And you know, those cases point to a couple of things that I think, and there's been research on this, so I think more people are starting to understand it, but the worst kinds of evidence are eyewitness evidence and confessions. And you know, but I think that for much of my life, people would have thought those 2 things would be the best kinds of evidence, but they're not. So I point to those cases because I think we like to think we do things right in Nebraska, but not always. And it's really important. You know, the thing about our office is we're there, you know, trying to stand up for our clients and make sure that these kinds of things don't happen. They don't happen. I mean, I like to think these kinds of things are aberrations, but it's important that that the system works properly for everybody. And until I became the elected public defender, and that was 4 years ago, I was going to court every day, several times a day, with clients, and my focus has changed. Interestingly, Florida, Tennessee, Nebraska, and the city of San Francisco are the only places that elect public defenders. And I don't know why the city of San Francisco, but other places, the public defenders are appointed, and I talk to other chiefs who frequently are concerned that whatever board has appointed them, or judges, don't like it if they're too aggressive representing people. And that's a terrible thing, where people are getting pressure not to be zealous advocates for their clients. And fortunately, that's not the issue when you're elected. And so I do have to go to the county board for our budget and to get additional staff approved, but I do have some autonomy that I think has played a role in our office having such a great reputation over the years. We've really been groundbreaking in a number of things. We were one of the first places to track time. We were one of the first offices that did a caseload or workload standard study. We were one of the first offices to have management information system, case management system. And all of those things have kind of helped maintain quality. And you have a lot of, there's frequently an image that public defenders are overworked and burn out and don't care, and that's not true, not in our office. And we have a lot of people who have been there a very long time, are very, very dedicated, and I'm really proud of the work that they do. But since I took over, and I'm not going to court all of the time, I've been able to focus on criminal justice reform issues, and it's been a particularly hot topic here in Nebraska, and it's been exciting for me because I like the political process to be involved in those issues. But right now Nebraska's prisons are at 162% of capacity, and the first place men go is called the Diagnostic and Evaluation Center. It's out near Pioneers Park, and they've been at 300% of capacity. People go there for 90 days, and then they get classified and move to the other facilities. And 70% of the people in our Nebraska prison system are there for nonviolent offenses. And so, a lot of people at the legislature, well, not just the legislature, but I think throughout society are starting to question, is what we're doing smart? Because incarcerating people is the most expensive thing we do. It costs about $35,000 a year to keep somebody in prison. And it doesn't work. You can take somebody who's low risk and put them in prison, you're going to make them high risk. And we can't incarcerate people into compliance with the law. And our country, the sentences are longer than most places too. But this is a problem, obviously here in Nebraska, but it's a problem really all over the country. The United States has 2.3 million people in prison. China has 1.6 million. Russia has 646,000. Well, think about that. China has 1 billion people, and they don't have as many people in prison as we do. There's 201,000 women in prison in the United States. That's 1 out of 3 women in prison in the world. And China is second with 84,000. And the impact on somebody going to prison is devastating, but it's not just on that person who goes to prison. There's 41,000 kids in Nebraska who have a parent in prison, and there's trauma that comes from that. I know I've seen things about prisons in some of the European countries where people are treated in a much different way, where their families come to see them, they leave to go to work, they're just treated differently. And I think that a lot of Americans look at that and think, well, they're coddling criminals. But the reality is they wind up treating issues and they have lower recidivism rates. And so many of the people we represent have mental health and substance abuse issues. If you don't treat those underlying issues, people are going to continue to get in trouble. And one of the things I've become convinced that we have to change our approach on is the war on drugs. I don't think it's any more effective than Prohibition was. We're trying to treat a health problem in the criminal justice system. And what we've done is put hundreds of thousands of people in prison and ruin lives. And what are we accomplishing? Because people certainly haven't stopped using drugs any more than people stopped drinking alcohol during Prohibition. And particularly, I think, as we're seeing around the country, and I think it'll be coming here to Nebraska, we'll be looking at legalization of marijuana. The dependency rate for marijuana is 9%. It's the same as caffeine. And, tobacco has a higher dependency rate than heroin. And, nobody's saying we should make tobacco illegal, but think about how we've been able to reduce smoking through education and taxation and, different kinds of regulation. And I think that these states that are dealing with marijuana have found a more effective way than locking people up. And particularly with that drug, its use runs across racial and socioeconomic lines, but African Americans are almost 4 times as likely to be arrested. And how can you explain that other than to say that there's racism in our system? And it's frequently not overt racism, but when you see results that are like that, you just have to wonder. And one of the things that as we've seen with the whole Black Lives Matter movement, really need to have everybody in the system trained in implicit bias. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but you can Google implicit bias, and you can take the Harvard implicit bias test, and it's really interesting because explicit bias is when people just openly admit prejudice. Implicit bias is inside of us, and many people don't realize they have it. But if you're honest, we all realize we all have bias. And that training, because what happens frequently on these police shootings with African Americans, it's not that the officer went into the incident planning to shoot this person, but they have a heightened sense of tension because they have implicit bias. And so they're more likely to pull that gun out and shoot. And so if you can make people aware that they have bias, hopefully they hesitate a little bit and don't treat people differently. And so I hope that just becomes standard practice for everybody in the system. I mean, certainly law enforcement, because the consequences can be life-ending, but I think everybody in the system ought to go through it, because a lot of times people are quite stunned to realize that they have bias inside them. And I know that I had a couple of particular cases that really bothered me, where I was representing, in each case I represented an African-American woman who was from Michigan, was driving on the interstate, who got pulled over. And one was pulled over for obstructed windshield because she had an evergreen air freshener hanging from her rear view mirror. Now this happened to an African-American legislator from Omaha, and she was able to get the law changed. So it's now a secondary offense. You can't be pulled over for that reason. But think about how many people have something hanging from the rear view mirror. And I just know for myself, I'm never going to get pulled over for that reason. I know that the reason that person got pulled over is because of the color of their skin. And, and the thing about those cases, and the second person was stopped for following too closely. And there's an area on the west side of town when the interstate speed limit drops from 75 to 65. And I remember a state trooper telling me that they called that area the kill zone because it's so easy to make stops. And for a long time there was construction when they were widening to 3 lanes. You could have enough space between you and the car in front of you, and somebody pulls in front of you and now you're following too closely, and then you get pulled over. And again, I mean, we could pull over all kinds of people for that. But, who winds up getting stopped? And the thing about these cases, the only cases that are going to come to us like that is somebody who actually has 20 pounds of pot in the trunk. It's not going to be the person who didn't have anything, because they're not going to get charged. But I remember on those cases, because it involved a couple of state troopers who were kind of the superstars of the state patrol for making drug arrests. And one of them told me in a deposition that they probably, because they were the best at finding drugs, they were probably finding drugs in 25 to 30% of the vehicles they searched. Now you have to understand, a lot of people think if the police ask you if they can search, you have to say yes. Well, no, you don't have to say yes, because you can require them to get a warrant or show they've met one of the exceptions to a warrant. But a lot of people think if they say yes, the officer's just going to glance in the back seat, and that's not what's going to happen. They're going to tear your car apart. So people wind up stuck on the side of the road for a couple of hours while their car's being torn apart. And so sure, people have nothing, then they get to go on their way, but they've had their life impacted in that situation. And I think a lot of people have trouble understanding search and seizure law because they think, well, this person had drugs, so why, this is a technicality. The Constitution's not a technicality. When we're protecting the rights of our client, who we think was subjected to an illegal search, we're protecting the rights of all those other people who got searched for maybe no good reason and hassled before they get to go on their way. Because the police shouldn't be able to pull somebody over for no reason at all. Or they shouldn't be able to pull somebody over because of the color of their skin. And again, I think if you talk to those officers, it wouldn't have been an overt thing. I just think that it happens with implicit bias, where people start having these suspicions in their mind. And, so it's one of those things. I mean, my wife and I have joked that, she could be, middle-aged white woman driving a minivan could go across the country with a vehicle full of drugs, and she's not going to get pulled over. And maybe that is what's happening. We know there's plenty of drugs out there, and they certainly aren't catching it all. But I think, those kinds of instances are very frustrating for me because the law says that what they did was appropriate. But I think as a society, we have to decide that we're going to care more about racism than about whether somebody's smoking pot. And because what's a greater evil? And and so I look at what's happening out in Colorado and the revenue they've raised, and they're not spending all the expense of prosecuting people, and there's the consequences of you get a drug conviction, you can't get federal student loans, you can't get federal housing, you could be subject to deportation depending on your immigration status, and I saw a presentation from the governor of Colorado 6 months ago, and he said that the only age group where use increased when they legalized marijuana in Colorado was the people over 65. He said he didn't know why. I don't know if baby boomers are returning to their roots or they have more health issues, but anyway, I think it's something that's likely coming here. Sooner rather than later, and it would be a lot smarter for our political leaders to get out in front of it and come up with a well-thought-out system of regulation and taxation. And even I look at Portugal. They decriminalized all drugs. They had one of the worst rates of HIV from needle use, and now they basically have small fines or they send people to treatment, and that HIV rate has gone way down. And because again, I think we've been trying to treat a health problem in the criminal justice system. One of the things that we have learned a lot about in recent years is trauma, and childhood trauma particularly, which has incredibly devastating impacts on people for years and years and years. And there's an ACE trauma test that there's 10 questions. And if you answer yes to 4 of these, you've suffered from some trauma. And I think it's interesting because I think it's interesting to think about. So, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid you might be physically hurt? Did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? Did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? Did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat, had to wear dirty clothes, and had no one to protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? Were your parents ever separated or divorced? Was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her, or sometimes often or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, hit with something hard, or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or knife? Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or who used street drugs? Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Did a household member go to prison? Now, I can tell you that we represent a lot of people who say yes to almost all those questions. And the impact of that, cumulative impact of the trauma, research has shown is worse than somebody who was in Iraq or Afghanistan in a war zone. And so sure, some people are able to overcome all of that and do fine. But I don't think it's a surprise when people wind up really damaged and in the criminal justice system. And I think about those things because I see a lot of instances where people come to our office, and there's been a story in the paper about this crime they're alleged to have committed, and people read those stories and think, oh, this person did a terrible thing, they're a terrible person. And then you get to know them, and they've been through all kinds of terrible things, and you realize they've been damaged and they need help. And if we don't help them, they're going to get in trouble again. And the idea that you're going to lock somebody up and that's going to change their behavior, is just ludicrous. And people are starting to get it, and not just, and people from all ends of the political spectrum are starting to get it. I think liberals who think we should, do more to treat these problems, but I see conservatives who think, we're wasting money. Why should we spend $35,000 a year for something that's ineffective? Because except for the most serious crimes, people are going to get out of prison. So doing nothing to address the underlying problems is just dumb. And so it's been interesting to see people start to recognize things and work on trying to reform things. And I'm quite passionate about dealing with people with mental health issues in a more humane and effective way than what we're doing right now, because we have so many people with mental health issues in the criminal justice system. And if you go back 60 years, we used to warehouse people in mental hospitals, and there was a move to deinstitutionalize, but we never adequately funded community services. And so what's happened is many of these people wind up in our criminal justice system. And it's a big problem here, but it's a big problem all over. The Cook County Jail in Chicago is the #1 mental health provider in the United States. They appointed a clinical psychologist to be their jail director. #2 is the LA County Jail, and #3 is Rikers Island in New York. This is something that's going on everywhere. And I've been quite involved in our drug court, and drug courts are really well established. There's thousands of them around the country, but there are other types of problem-solving courts that try to focus on addressing the underlying problems. And the recidivism rates are much lower than sending people to prison, and for a fraction of the cost. So instead of $35,000 a year, you're spending maybe $5,000 to $7,000 a year. But we've established we've had a drug court, we've established a veterans court, and I'm chairing the statewide Supreme Court committee to establish mental health courts. I'm also on a committee that is looking at DUI courts. But by trying to focus on those underlying problems, hopefully these people don't keep coming back into the system. And the mental health court, I know, will only deal with a small piece of the problem. If we really want to deal with mental health issues as a society, we need to spend more resources. We need to put more. We decreased the number of inpatient beds. Now we don't have enough inpatient beds, and we don't have enough community programming. And there's all kinds of other pieces of it. People can't access medication. If we expanded Medicaid, thousands of people in the state of Nebraska could access mental health medication. And that's the thing, when I'm talking about mental health court, I'm just talking about somebody who's got a little bit, they're nervous. I'm talking about people who are schizophrenic or have bipolar disorder, major mental illnesses, and they come through the criminal justice system. But if you can get them on medication and get them housing, some people might need a case manager to check on them, some people need structured residential placements, they're not going to come back into the system. They're only in the system because of their illness. And what we're doing is it's really ineffective, it's expensive, and it's cruel. And but that's something that I'm excited to work on, and I look forward to when we can get those courts established. But and maybe they'll also help shine a light on the need for additional services. We've been trying to work on whether we could start a pretrial diversion program for drunk driving. Those have been very effective. There's a really effective program in South Dakota that we just started it on a small scale called 24/7, that people come in and test twice a day, and if they test positive, they go to jail for increasing amounts of time right away as a condition of their bond. But it's been incredibly effective, not only reducing drunk driving, but reducing domestic violence and even the mortality rate up in the communities that are using it up in South Dakota. I was involved in the efforts to end the death penalty here, and I was very sad when it got voted back in, because it's expensive, it's not a deterrent. I think it's barbaric. There's a huge racial disparity. There's 12 people on Nebraska's death row, and 9 are minorities. That's just embarrassing. The race of the victims is frequently the determining factor, and of course, there have been people exonerated nationwide. It's hard on victims because the cases go on and on. And I have a friend who's a history professor here who specializes in Holocaust studies, and I'm going to give him a shout out because I can. But his name's Gerald Steinecker, and you ought to take a class from him because you'd learn a lot. But he said one time that Europe saw we're giving the state the ultimate power could lead, and they're never going to go there again. And I think those are wise words. I think, if you want to be judged by the company you keep, are we more similar to France and Germany and Canada and Australia? Or are we more similar to China and Saudi Arabia and Iran and Iraq? Because we're grouped with the second group of countries when you look at who's executing people. And it's not about the fact that people have committed heinous crimes. It's about us as a society. I believe being on the right side of history is to ultimately get rid of the death penalty. And I think it will happen, but I'm sad about where we are as a state right now. One of the issues I have pledged myself to work on and was involved last year in some reform is bond. That's the purpose. The purpose of bond is money to get people to come back to court. And the research shows that posting money bears no relationship to whether somebody comes back to court or they're less of a risk to the community. And we're seeing this happen all over the country, either legislatively or through litigation. The District of Columbia releases 90% of the people in pretrial release programs or no release, no conditions at all, and 90% of those people come back to court without committing any crimes. California just ended money bond a couple of weeks ago. But there have been other places, Alaska, New Jersey, Maryland, the city of, I know Houston and New Orleans, there was litigation. Prosecutors in Philadelphia and Richmond have pledged to stop seeking money bond. Because what happens is, it doesn't keep us safer, it doesn't make sure people come back to court. It means that people who don't have money stay in jail. So what we have done is we have criminalized poverty, and that's wrong. And so I intend to be involved until we get rid of money bond here in Nebraska. And so those are a lot of the things that I've been working on, but I think as we try to change the focus on drug issues to prevention and treatment from criminal justice, if we provide more services in our community, we train people on trauma and implicit bias, we work on trying to reduce poverty, we make the system less racist, and we stop criminalizing poverty, I think we'll have a more fair, more just system. And again, I'm very, very proud of the quality work that we do, and I'm excited to be part of the broader effort to change the criminal justice system. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Oh, appreciate it very much. I got a mic here. If you'd like to pose a question or two.
Hi.
Hi.
I guess I'd just like to know what's your guys' relationship with Lincoln Police, since they work a lot with prosecutors.
I think it's actually quite good. It doesn't mean that there aren't times where there would be conflict, but I don't know if some of it's just the nature of people in the Midwest are generally nice, and it's a small enough community that we work with each other and you have to get along. But that doesn't mean that people in our office aren't aggressive at questioning police when they think they've done something wrong or haven't done everything to prove the case. But I think generally the relationship, I think there's a lot of mutual respect in those offices. And the same with the prosecutors. And I think that, again, I don't think that we're not working hard for our clients, but it certainly makes the work atmosphere a little more pleasant, that I think the relationships are pretty positive.
As you're thinking, I'll pose one to you, more of a numbers issue. How many public defender staff, how large is your staff at the public defender's office?
I think we have 42, that includes 23 attorneys. So there's a couple of investigators, social worker. I have 5 paralegals, and there's some secretaries. We have 4 law clerks who are law students working for us part-time. They do research. It's grown a lot because when I started, there were 10 attorneys and probably just a couple of support staff. And so.
It was a loaded question, too, because you have interns from our department as well.
Correct.
Joe Renteria.
We've had interns who are criminal justice majors for years. They generally work with our investigators, and they get to help do witness interviews and learn a lot about the system. And I think that the people who have interned for us have found it a really positive experience.
Yes, they have, and hope some of these young people will have that opportunity as well.
Yeah.
You covered a lot of subjects. Let's see what other questions you might have.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the process for establishing the mental health court. I've heard discussion about it for a number of years, and I'm wondering if there are barriers that are preventing it, or if it's just kind of a long process to get that started.
Well, it's proven to be a longer process than I had hoped. We have a standards subcommittee, and they're working on drafting the standards. And Richard Weiner from here at the university is on that subcommittee. And in fact, I just saw the problem-solving coordinator for Nebraska because he's on that subcommittee, and I asked how are we doing, because it's proven to be complicated. But the committee is a diverse group of providers, prosecutors, defense attorneys, judges, just lots of different people. And once the standards are done, then we'll have to get approval from the Supreme Court. And then we have the easy task of convincing the legislature to fund us. So, but, the thing about it is you need to spend the money up front. But it will save money down the road because if that person doesn't get in trouble in the future, then, we're not going to be incarcerating them, let alone the crimes that they won't commit. So it's going to be a little different. Our problem-solving courts right now are all the adult ones, drug court and vets court, are felonies. I envision this will be a two-tiered court. There'll be felonies and misdemeanors. And that'll be part of the tricky part is, like what are the eligible offenses? Right now we don't take violent offenses for drug court. Vets court is a little broader. But to capture the target population for mental health court, we're going to have to include some violent offenses. But on the misdemeanor end, there are people who get arrested all the time for nuisance offenses. They go to jail for a couple of days for trespass or disturbing the peace. Now, somebody who doesn't have any insight into their illness is probably going to be pretty hard to persuade them to participate in a problem-solving court. If they just think, I just want to get out of jail, I'll get a $100 fine and I'll be gone. But if you have somebody who has enough insight that they want help, then we can bring them in. I think that the misdemeanor court will probably have to be a little more modest because you're not going to keep people for years. But if we can get people on meds and find housing for them, we can probably get them out of the revolving door, at least some of them. So, but the standards there have been some other internal political kinds of things with the state, but the standards is kind of been the part that's taken more work because it's a little bit different kind of court than drug court. But there are hundreds of mental health courts around the country, so they do exist. They have been working, and because I enjoy the political process, I look forward to going over and making the case to try and get some funds, and I hope we'll be able to do that. And I would anticipate, I certainly hope that Lancaster County is going to have one of the first ones. We have, some parts of the state have no mental health services. We at least have services, there's just not enough, but I think this is a smart place to start it, so.
Similar question about, you talked about trying to get rid of money bond. Is that something that's a dream down the road? Is it something that there's stuff actively being done in Nebraska right now to reduce?
Well, I was involved in the effort there was a bill passed last year that added the factor that when judges set bond, they had to consider defendants' financial ability to pay. Unfortunately, all too often, we still see judges saying they're taking that into consideration and then setting what the state wants. And I've become convinced, based on that, and based on what I'm seeing nationally, that we just need to end it. And so I'm very hopeful that we'll get a senator to introduce legislation to end money bond this session. And there have been lawsuits won in different parts of the country, so if the legislature's smart, they'll get rid of it before they lose a lawsuit. And because you can say that this keeps the community safe. No, it doesn't. It keeps poor people in jail. So I don't know how anybody can say we should continue, because you can do pretrial risk assessments, and that's a much more effective way at identifying who shouldn't get out. The danger with those assessments is you have to make sure that those don't wind up using factors that are still going to keep poor people or people of color in custody. But if you have a good system, but we already know that the current system does that. So, you know, I think this is a better way to go. But I'm hopeful that the legislature will see fit to do this, and I can't say it's going to happen next session. Sometimes things take years, but if it happened in California, and we don't even have the issue of bail bondsmen in Nebraska. They're a huge political force in states. They donate money to candidates, and they lost in California. They're going to go out of business there. So we don't have them to contend with, fortunately. So it might be easier here than a lot of people think. But I think people have to, as long as people realize that they're safe. That's the problem, is when people are scared, they'll vote for all kinds of things. They'll give up all kinds of rights. And people need to not be scared about this, but you know, think about how this system treats poor people right now. So, you had a question?
Hi. Okay, I had a question about the ACE trauma test.
Yes.
You said it's 10 questions, and if you answer yes to 4 of the questions, then you've gone through some sort of trauma. But
yes.
You said you listed off some of the questions, but aren't those questions kind of broad? Because can't you go through like one of those things like, oh, yes, my father punched my mother, but that was it. Like, aren't those kind of broad? Because you also listed off like another thing like, oh, my father shot my mother. Like, there's a difference there, you know?
Well, probably going to have to ask a psychologist to explain quantifying it. But I know enough about that test that if you say yes at all, you know, then you have, you know, if you say yes to 4 of those questions, you're considered to have some trauma. But there's different levels of trauma, and we see that manifesting itself in clients all the time. So, you know, and as I said, I mean, a lot of people I think might say yes to 1 or 2, but when I see scores, because we added that once we kind of did some training on that, like I persuaded the drug court team to do that as part of our screening for people. It doesn't get people in or out of drug court, but you know, when I see people, because sometimes people won't admit to stuff until they've been like working with a therapist for an extended period of time. They've buried it or it's painful. So when I see people who like openly come in and they haven't even been in the program and they're already saying yes and they got a score of 8 or 9, oh my gosh, you know, you know, what they went through as a child, nobody should have to go through, and we should be trying to help them and not thinking that we're going to lock them up and that's going to fix things, because that's dumb.
Here you go.
So I know there's been legislation in the last few years proposed that all juveniles are entitled to an attorney, and that has only taken effect in Omaha and Lincoln, I believe. So just curious how that's affected your office. If there's been any positive or negative consequences as a result, and what your office's opinion is in terms of that broadening to the rest of the state in more rural areas.
Yeah, I'm well aware of that legislation. I know that there were people who, there were people that thought, oh my gosh, our caseload's going to explode, and the judges were nervous because we're only going to take so many cases because of our standards, because that keeps our own workload manageable. Well, outside attorneys cost more than people in our office because they bill by the hour. It hasn't really changed things in Lancaster County that much. So, you know, that's a good thing. That was a bill by Patty Pansing Brooks, and I'm well aware of it because the reality is it's the right thing to do. And the legislature was worried about the cost. So they passed it for Lancaster, Douglas, and Sarpy County. Now, how on earth can that be constitutional that if you live in one of the other 90 counties, you don't have a right to a lawyer? I mean, that's ridiculous. And they tried to get it extended in the last session, and some of the arguments by the opponents about how, oh, well, the judge has the client, they have their best interest in mind, the judge and the parents, we don't need a lawyer getting in between them. Really? Because if it was you, do you think you'd want to have a lawyer there? Or you're just going to have a judge telling you, oh, go ahead and admit? I mean, it's just, you know, that's just ridiculous. And making a decision about what's right to do based on money, those people ought to be ashamed of themselves. So I think it'll happen. But, you know, we're going to have to overcome some people who are small-minded. But there's been a lot of good things on juvenile justice reform, and we still need to do more. I mean, we're reducing the number of people we detain, but, you know, Lancaster County particularly, we detain too many kids. Even though the numbers are down, we place too many kids out of the home. We send too many kids to Kearney and Geneva. And, you know, I remember when I was a young lawyer working in juvenile court, and at that time I thought, boy, somebody's in a bad household. If I was a judge, I'd try to move them out of the home. But, you know, you get older and you see research that sometimes, unless it's pretty horrific, those kids are better off in the home, and providing services is the right thing to do. But it's hard to change people who've been stuck in that mindset for a long time. But the research shows, and the more we can do to try and keep kids in the home, the better off they're going to be. But we've got to provide the services they need. So that's an area I've been involved with that to some extent. Our Chief Deputy, Margene Tim, is really a leader in juvenile justice reform, and I lean on her quite heavily on those issues because she's so good. But you know, people have to be open to new research. I mean, if you think we knew everything, and we're never going to learn something new, I don't care what field it is. That's pretty silly. So.
Got time for one more. I came over to this side of the room to give you folks over here a chance. Thoughts, concerns, reactions, genuflections? Here you go.
Hello, sir. You were talking about abolishing the death penalty.
Yes.
Kind of along with those ladies over there. How long do you think that would legislatively take? I know.
Well, it's going to take longer than I thought it was going to. I'd like to say that, you know, in another decade it won't exist anywhere. We'll need some different people on the U.S. Supreme Court maybe, but so, you know, which might require expansion of the court, the way things are headed. But I think, you know, people are realizing it doesn't work. I think they're realizing how expensive it is. They're seeing innocent people on death row. And as I said, I think you're judged by the company you keep. And I think all those arguments, 20 years ago, when Nebraska had its last execution, support for the death penalty in Nebraska was over 90%. Well, when we voted 2 years ago, it passed with 60%. So, yeah, I guess, and I'm an optimist by nature, but I believe in a decade the support will be below 50% in Nebraska. And again, it's not that the crimes aren't horrific, but it's about us, you know. I mean, and anybody who thinks that they're for the death penalty, would you be the person to stick the needle in their vein? Would you do it? Because if you're not going to do it yourself, you sure as heck shouldn't be delegating it to somebody else. And we sure shouldn't be doing it behind a curtain. So, I think it'll be gone before too long.
Thank you very much. You've given us a lot to think about. Appreciate it. Time is far spent. I'm sure Joe would be willing to visit with you further. Come have some punch and cookies just across the hall. And a round of applause for our speaker who's taken time to come by today.